Scott let Margaret digest his statement before continuing. As unpleasant as it was for him to say, he could see it was equally agonizing to hear. I got too big for my britches, thinking we were indomitable, fighting fire, saving folk their homes, wildlife. But you did do all of those things. He'd not had any balance. Too many shifts, long hours in the gym, and obsession with getting the right amount in the bank. The one thing he'd never done was cheat. Heaven knew there'd been opportunities. The fire bunnies, as his squad called them, were always in the bar around the pool table, ready to offer a ride home after a long day out on shift, but none of them were Margaret. That, and he'd been too damn blinkered about being the best to notice. I prioritized work over you. It was a bad call. I'm sure there were plenty of girls willing to fill my shoes when you gave me the flick. He physically felt the heartache in her voice. No one would have. Why? A simple question with a complicated answer. The fire I was telling you about, the one I went to with Caleb. She nodded. On paper, we had everything we needed. New gear, new helicopter, a big old forest fire. Couldn't wait to get out there. Caleb was nervous, but I'd convinced him we'd be fine. 2 top lads in the class. Who better? An excruciating tightness seized his chest as the memories flooded back. We were in the chopper standing at the door, ready to jump when we hit the right spot. Just as we found a clear bit in the woods, gusts kicked in, and we both fell out. Of the chopper? Margaret asked through her fingers. He nodded. We both caught air with our parachutes in time. Caleb made ground. I got stuck in a tree about 50 meters above him. It was the most terrifying moment of his life. He watched the blood drain from Margaret's face as he continued. The wind shifted along with the fire. The fact that Scott had survived was little short of a miracle. He'd curled himself into a ball and felt the fire wash over him with a scalding intensity he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. The temperatures were doubled down on the forest floor, where Caleb had been unable to find cover. The helicopter had come back lowered a rope and pulled Scott up as the fire continued its low, lethal sweep across the forest floor. Oh, Scott, no! A low moan came from Margaret's throat, almost identical to Caleb's wife keening over her husband's casket. Scott had sworn then and there he would never put Margaret through that sort of pain. She reached out and touched the edge of the scar by his shirt sleeve. Didn't either of you have safety equipment? Faulty. He slowly undid his shirt cuffs and rolled them up to expose the scars that would mark him for life. At the time, they told me I was lucky. Margaret shook her head. No, I can't bear it. That reaction is precisely why I wrote to you. Her eyes widened. I wasn't saying... I know, but I was so repulsed by myself I couldn't imagine anyone loving me. I had 3rd-degree burns across my backhead arms. Scarred forever. But Caleb died. Died because I'd not been strong enough to say, not today. Not this fire. I was no good to anyone. I would have come out. I would have helped. I don't think anyone could have helped. Not then. He'd repelled everyone, pushed the person he loved most as far away as possible. So, what happened? What changed? Caleb's widow and the lads at the fire station helped me. Margaret's brow crinkled. What did they do? It was what they didn't do that made the difference. Which was, they didn't coddle me, or respond to my moods, or my self-pity. They were tough, dragged me to my rehab sessions, drove me to my PTSD appointments no matter how much I cursed them. They blanked all my moods, my anger, my rage, my shame. As harrowing as this was to hear, Margaret knew she needed to hear the whole story. It was the only way she would understand who the man sitting next to her was now. He definitely wasn't the Scott who'd left her with a soul-quenching kiss, and a promise to return on bended knee all those years ago. Was he still a man she could marry? A man she could trust? Or was he a man she needed to make her peace with and say goodbye to forever? I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Scott scrubbed a hand through his hair, a flash of his scarring catching the candlelight as he did. It sounds selfish now, but I split up with you because I was in the darkest place imaginable. A place I never wanted you to see, let alone knew existed. Her heart twisted in agony that he'd gone through all of this. It tightened again as she remembered the heartbreak she'd endured, wondering what she'd done wrong, questioning herself, her life goals, revisiting their emails again and again to see if there was anything she could have done better, when all along they had only needed each other. Eventually, she said what they both knew: love doesn't work like that. I know that now. The second I saw you again, I knew that. He gave a rueful laugh. I'm hoping to God I'm not too late to convince you I'm a changed man. I'm actually shocked you even joined me tonight. You and me both, Margaret said emotionally, although the timing's pretty hilarious. She clapped her fingers to her mouth. She hadn't meant to mention her job offer, and yet, as painful as their talk had been so far, there was that deep-seated level of familiarity and comfort they'd once shared, rising to the surface, as naturally as lungs took in air. The same feeling she'd felt that very first day they'd clapped eyes on one another and just knew. Why, what's funny about the timing? I finally began to see things from your perspective. What do you mean? Scott looked genuinely confused. You know, you wanted to travel the world, try out all sorts of incredible jobs in equally amazing places, and I was happy here. So, the flecks of brightness that had appeared in his eyes dimmed. You're moving. What about Becca? She's happy in uni. There are carers in place to help her there? She pulled out the letter she'd tucked into her handbag and handed it to him. His eyebrows lifted as he let out a low whistle. Canine mountain rescue training in New Zealand, huh? She nodded, her top teeth biting down hard on her lower lip. Have you accepted it? Not yet. Do you want to go? She hesitated. There was a part of her that wanted to, but earlier today, she'd been willing to chuck it in because her bestie was having a bad day. Was she really capable of packing up her entire life just to prove her ex-boyfriend wrong? I suppose I wanted to prove to you and to myself that I had what it took to do something courageous. Scott pulled her hands into his. You are the most courageous person I know. You stayed here helping your family, your sister, when I know you wanted to join me. Tears stung at her eyes. She truly had, but there was no way she could have left. Not with her sister and parents so reliant on her. Maybe she should have taken that risk. Perhaps if she'd gone out there, it would have changed their lives too. Scott cupped her chin in his big hand and said solemnly, I've learnt the hard way that staying is one of the bravest things a person can do. What are you saying, exactly? I'm trying to tell you that wherever you go, whatever path you choose, I'll be with you if you want me to be. Thick and thin. Good times, bad times, all of it. The waiter approached one last time. Can we offer you anything to eat tonight? Margaret picked up her menu with a smile. Suddenly, she was ravenous. Good session, Andy. Margaret gave the ex-soldier a smile, though she knew it wouldn't be returned. The poor man had some serious PTSD following a few stints out in the Middle East. He'd been at the clinic for a wee while now, ever since Charles and Esme had heard of his devastating injuries that had landed him in a wheelchair. There was no chance they'd abandon their older brother's best friend in the military, especially as he didn't have any family to look after him. She felt a swell of gratitude for Scott's fellow firefighters how they'd rallied round him in his time of need. She swallowed back the inevitable sting of tears. It wasn't worth thinking about what would have happened if they hadn't been around for him. The door to the training room opened, and Flora Andy's physio came in with her usual bright smile. "All right, Andy, has Margaret put you and Sterling through your paces?" His eyes drifted up to her as he reached out to pet his service dog's head. Flora and Margaret shared a smile. It was a small gesture, but a step forward. When they'd first met Andy, he was completely unresponsive. "How was your date the other night?" Flora whispered as she unlocked the brake on Andy's wheelchair. Despite herself, Margaret grinned. "Not a date." After she and Scott had poured their hearts out to one another, the two of them had been ravenous. They'd eaten shared more stories, and by the end of the meal, Margaret felt she'd learnt more about Scott in the one sitting than she had in all the time they'd been together. Afterwards, they'd shared a chaste kiss and had agreed to keep the lines of dialogue open. Well, not date exactly, but to see each other and see what happened. There was still a part of her whispering, "It's too good to be true," a part insisting she stay wary. When they emerged from the training room, Lyle walked into the reception area where beyond him, a car drove off from the castle. "All right, everyone," they said they were except for Andy, whose eyes drifted to his German shepherd. "Was that Charles away to his conference?" Margaret asked. "Aye, a few days down south before the next group of patients begin to arrive." He put up a finger. "Which reminds me, I've got a young patient and her father coming from Norway soon." "Norway!" Flora grinned at Margaret. "Are they trainee Vikings?" Lyle gave her one of his serious looks. Flora shrugged it off and asked, "Any special requirements?" "The little girl Meta will stay up here for the first stint, but her father will need accommodation." "Is the wee cottage next to yours still available to let?" "I think so." Flora's mouth twisted to the side as she thought about it. "I'll ask the owner next time I see him and let you know." "Excellent. Right then. That's Axel and Meta sorted for now." Lyle tapped the files he was carrying. "Best get on." As he went to leave the clinic, the door was opened by a big, tall bear of a man who stood to the side as Lyle passed. Flora's eyes shot to Margaret. "Another date." "Dog walk," Margaret said firmly. "In the rain." She nodded to the inclement weather beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass reception area. "Definitely not a date." "Ah!" Flora whispered over her shoulder as she began to wheel Andy out of the clinic. "I get it. It's a test." Scott tugged his collar up to keep the driving rain from pouring down his neck. A nice change from pulling it up to hide his scars. "Do you always walk the hounds when the weather is this awful?" "Rain or shine," Margaret answered cheerfully. "Just like the postman. I suppose if they're service dogs, their owners will need to go out in all conditions." "Exactly." Margaret nodded at the castle as they headed towards the woodland path. "You should see it at Christmas." Margaret sighed wistfully. "It's just amazing." "With any luck, I will." He gave her a meaningful look. She blushed, then looked away. The love he'd always felt for her flared hot and bright. Sharing the core-deep anguish he'd been through had made him feel as vulnerable as he'd felt when he'd been snared in the tree as Caleb descended into the woodland below. This time, however, the vulnerability wasn't laced with fear. It was buffered with hope. "I haven't even asked where you're staying," Margaret said after a few minutes of contemplative silence. "Up at the Stag's house." Margaret shot him an impressed look. "I didn't realize the wildfire fighting service paid that well." "It doesn't," he answered neutrally. He'd saved a lot, but nothing like what his savings were now. "The equipment manufacturers do when things go wrong." "Ah," Margaret swallowed. "I'm still shocked it even happened." Weren't there tests? Scott shrugged. Usually, should have been. It's another life lesson, I suppose. Not everything's foolproof. She glanced at him and snorted. What? Scott laughed, and Play elbowed her in the ribs. Are you suggesting I'm not foolproof? Ha! Margaret was laughing now, too. I think we both know you are the least foolproof man I've ever loved. He stopped and pulled her into his arms. Without jealousy, he asked, There have been others. Oh, Margaret said seriously, though her eyes twinkled with mischief. There's Rufus and a Jazz and wait a minute. Scott pulled her in even closer to him. Are you putting me on a lower rung than your dogs? They aren't any old dogs. Margaret's gaze dipped down, then back up to meet his. They've been with me through everything. Sounds like I owe them a thank you card. His voice thickened as he tipped her chin up towards him and said, Give me time. Give us time. Then he lowered his mouth to hers. Her lips were every bit as soft as he remembered, sweet and perfectly matched to his. He could smell her warm, sugary scent as he pulled back to check she was all right with this comfortable with the intimacy. Her green eyes glowed with consent. He dipped his mouth to hers again and drew kiss after kiss, praying each one meant she was giving him a chance. It wouldn't be easy, but if he played it right, he just might be able to win her heart back. So, Scott sounded nervous. What do you think? Margaret looked round the modern glass and timber house in awe. You've already put an offer in. Scott nodded, crinkles of concern fanning out at the corners of his eyes. You don't like it. She more than liked it. She loved it, but that wasn't the point. For a man who said he'd learnt his lesson about prioritizing her over money. He hadn't exactly asked her opinion. Was all of this a big show so he could live his way yet again? It's beautiful, she eventually conceded. It feels kind of Nordic. Scott smiled. It actually reminds me of the Pacific Northwest. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Interesting that he'd want memories of the place that had nearly killed him. I know. Scott shook his head as he ran a hand along one of the thick beams framing the wide sliding doors that led out to a stone patio facing the long stretch of blue water and surrounding evergreens. It's mad, but if I hadn't been through what I had, I might never have realized just how insanely I'd behaved. Leaving you behind when you were caring for your sister, it was selfish. I could have done the training any time. You were young. I was thinking about me, not about us. He pulled her into his arms and gave her a soft kiss. Despite herself, she leant into it. As beautiful as this house was being in Scott's arms, felt like home. When her hands slipped up to his hairline, he flinched and pulled away. Sorry, Has anyone apart from medical staff seen them? Margaret asked softly. The scars. He shook his head no. For a long time there, I felt as ugly on the inside as I did on the outside. And until that changed, I didn't believe I was worthy of love. What changed your mind? Caleb's widow. Margaret's brow dived down. How? He waved his hands. Nothing untoward. It was listening to her talk about her husband. How much she loved him. How she'd known from the moment she'd fallen in love with him that loving a firefighter came with risks. And that convinced you that you were worth loving? No. He laughed at the memory. She basically knocked my head against a wall until I began to hear what she was actually saying. Which was, That Caleb's priorities were always in the same order: his wife, his family, his work, then everything else. As long as that stayed solid, she said she was able to embrace the fears that came with loving a man who risked his life for a living. I don't get how that gave you confidence. Margaret wasn't judging. She wanted to understand. I had my priorities in the wrong order. The moment I put you back at the top of the list, a woman who I knew put her family first, I began to feel less dark inside. I had something to work towards. He swept her hair back across her shoulders. Someone to be a better man for. Margaret rewarded him with a gentle smile. She wasn't committing to things one way or another, but there was a glow of warmth in her eyes. Fancy showing me the rest of the house? Found it. Margaret commanded the dog she was working with to sit, then watched as Esme skipped down the length of the long training hall towards her, waving a paper in her hand. What the Holy Grail? No, Little Miss Hilarious. I've found my new charity. Great! Margaret whooped. Who's the lucky recipient? Plants to pause. Esme held out the paper with a ta-da. It's run by a chap called Max Kirkpatrick. The charity is the real deal. He set it up with his own money, but a developer's threatening to buy the land out from underneath him. Plants to pause. Margaret playfully tapped her chin. Is it for vegan dog owners? No, silly. It's for patients at Clydebank Hospital. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath. That's a pretty rough area of Glasgow. It was similar to the area where Scott had grown up. I know, but look. Esme held out the paper and tapped it. He's turned a vacant lot into veg plots and a wildflower meadow where patients can garden and visit with their pets. Sounds great. Scott could have done with a place like that when he was in hospital. Esme's eyes narrowed. What exactly is going on with him? Margaret looked away, then met her friend's gaze head on. It had been 3 weeks since they'd been seeing one another with increasing frequency. She had to tell her at some point. I think he wants me to marry him. What? You've not said yes, have you? No. Don't even answer that, because there's no way you can trust that lion-thieving bastard a second time. Esme shook her head, disappointed. He's hardly thieving, Margaret protested. He stole your heart, Esme snapped back. Before Margaret launched into a monologue about how Scott was working hard to prove he'd changed since his accident, she took an emotional step back from her friend's outrage. Esme had had an experience with an ex that had scarred her as deeply as Margaret had been by Scott, perhaps even more so. She took cautionary measures to a whole new level. Perhaps Margaret should be taking a page from the same book. The fact you're not wearing a ring yet should tell you something, Esme said seriously. You've been hurt once already. Badly. Just because he shows up all full of promises and a shiny new truck? Hey, you know as well as I do that I don't care about his financial status. It's the man who matters. Precisely, Esme said. And what's he done apart from come back here and tell you his sob story, huh? Taking you out for a couple of fancy dinners? Her shoulders dropped as a softness replaced her anger. Mags, you love your life here. He's only just come back. If it's meant to be, he'll stick around, but you need to make sure he wants to, and that this isn't some big, huge, guilty conscious thing. It was a good point. In the years they'd been apart, they'd both changed. As much as she was drawn to him, perhaps she was basing her desire to marry Scott on the hopes and dreams of people who didn't exist anymore. The Labrador she'd been working with nuzzled her hand. She gave his head a scrub. You're right. I know. Esme smirked, then pulled Margaret in for a hug and whispered, but mostly because I've learnt from a lot of my own mistakes. Margaret squeezed her back. Marrying the wrong man was a mistake she didn't want to make. Scott had been working so hard to prove he'd changed. but it wasn't exactly as if they'd been living real life these past few weeks. What if, after the glow of being reunited wore off, he got itchy feet again? What if that job in New Zealand really was meant to be? It all boiled down to one thing. She needed proof. Proof Scott was her Mr. Right. And if he wasn't, then there was no way she was going to invest any more time in a Mr. Wrong, no matter how much he made her tummy tingle. Scott pulled his truck into his usual spot outside the Canine Therapy Center. Funny how he'd been meeting Margaret for afternoon dog walks for just a few weeks, and it already felt routine. In a good way. Good, he supposed, because it meant seeing that smile that lit up his chest like a warm fire. Today, he had news. He hoped she was as happy about it as he was. "Hey, you!" Margaret came out from round the back of the stables with a small pack of hounds all on leads, all perfectly obedient. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something slightly reserved about her greeting. He crossed to her for a kiss and received a nice peck on the cheek instead. A car pulled into the lot behind them, and a tall, dark-haired man wearing specs got out with a broad smile. "All right, Margaret. Is Esme in?" "She's in with a client, Charles. If you give it a couple of minutes, she'll be done. There are some of Mrs. Renwick's trial Christmas bickies in reception if you'd like." Charles nodded at Scott. "New employee?" Scott stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Friend of Margaret's," he corrected. "Scott Campbell." When Charles had left, Scott took a few of the dog leads from her, then gave her free hand a squeeze. "You okay?" "What?" she asked. "You seem a bit distracted." Her eyes shifted over to where Charles was heading back to the castle, a whistled tune traveling in the wind behind him. "Sorry." She looked back at Scott as if she hadn't heard what he'd said. "That was really weird." "What?" She blinked. "Did you see how smiley he was?" Scott looked over his shoulder and saw Charles disappearing behind the huge entry doors. "Is that not normal?" She shook her head. "Nope, not even remotely. Guess he had a nice day at work. He's been at a conference down in England somewhere." She continued to frown at the castle. "Isn't it a good thing that he's in a good mood?" "Yes, of course, but he hasn't been this chirpy in years." "Any particular reason?" She ticked things off on her fingers. "Lots. Brother died in combat. Father had a heart attack. Family responsibilities, the list goes on." The man bears the mantle of responsibility like a cloak of doom. Looks like he's realized you can't fix the past. Maybe he's finally moved on. A light bulb went off in Scott's head. That had been his problem too, donning a cloak of responsibility no one had asked him to wear. Losing himself on a journey no one had asked him to take. Margaret hadn't asked for a house. She'd asked for him. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the ring box against his fingertips. Was he waiting yet again for his life to be in an exacting order before he proposed? Or was it the case that as much as he loved Margaret, they simply weren't right for one another anymore? There was only one way to find out. "What do you say?" Scott held out the ring again. A rose gold trinity knot with an oval emerald in the center of it. It was absolutely beautiful. As difficult as it was, she closed the lid, pushed it back to him, and shook her head. "I can't. I'm sorry." Scott's eyes darkened. He pocketed the ring so quickly it was as if she'd imagined it. "Fair enough." His voice was thick with emotion. She reached out and took his hand in hers. "It's not a no, Scott, but compromise." A wariness she hated seeing shifted through his pure blue eyes. "What sort?" "The kind that gives us more time." An urgency filled his body like electricity. "Mags, if there is one thing that I've learnt, it's that life is precious. It's also incredibly short. I want to live together, make babies together, build a business with our names above the door. All of the things we dreamt of, and I want to start doing them now. With you. She started to say something, then hesitated. Don't you want that anymore? Scott's eyes bore into her with an intensity she'd never seen before. Don't you want me? That's not it. It's just... She bit down on her lip, trying to choose her words perfectly. Trust the kind we'd had was something we'd built over years. I know now that you split up with me because you were wrestling with so many things, but we both know life isn't always a smooth ride. What if something else happens? How will I know you won't turn your back on me again? Scott shook his head as recognition dawned. Actions speak louder than words. A flush crept onto her cheeks, but she stuck to her guns. Afraid so. More so than a flashy ring and a shiny new house, she answered truthfully. I understand why you've done it. Bought the house, this beautiful ring. They're amazing, but I need to make sure we're both on the same page. What if another job offer comes? What if, God forbid, one of us gets hurt? Will the same thing happen? Scott took both of her hands in his. I will never, ever turn my back on you again. Not unless you tell me we're quits. That it's time to walk away. I don't want that. Not now, but I think we need to see how we go in real life. Finally, he laughed. Good call. As a matter of fact, he pulled a sheaf of papers out of the pocket inside his coat. I was looking into retraining as a paramedic. There's plenty of work here in Scotland, or, if you wanted me to come with you, New Zealand. Either way, if it doesn't work out, I'd... He scrubbed a hand through his hair and blew out a slow, jagged breath. I wouldn't like it, babe, but I'd go. I'd walk away, if that was what you wanted. Lesson learnt. Margaret traced a finger around his heart. I love you so much. I always have, from the moment we met. I feel the same way. He pressed soft kisses onto the backs of her hands. Which is why, if you need me to, I'll back off. Let's see how we go, shall we? Nice and slow, he said solidly, and then with a twinkle in his eye asked, How slow are you talking, treacle or ice age? Margaret laughed. Treacle sounds about right. Scott rubbed his hands together and looked up to the sky where stars were beginning to prick through the gloaming. This could be fun. Like a challenge to a knight. He broadened his Scots accent. What shall I do to prove my love for ye, lassie? Throw a caber for ye. Aye, that'll do nicely. She grinned up at him, accepting the big old cozy bear hug he was pulling her into. Shall I whisper sweet nothings into your hair? He asked through her pile of hair. Yes, please. Tell you I love you when you sleep. That'd be nice too. This was fun. Draw you baths of ass's milk and butterflies. She guffawed as Scott wrapped one arm across her shoulders and fanned his other out in front of her. Let's get these dogs walked, and then how would you feel about joining me on a first date? She tapped her finger against her lips. Toasty cheese sandwiches and a box set in front of the fire. A broad smile peeled his lips apart. Consider it done. 2 years later. The dogs look brilliant. Esme clapped her hands in delight. You look brilliant, Margaret enthused with equal glee. We all look brilliant, but mostly you. Esme took Margaret's hands in hers and stood back admiring the silk and tulle wedding dress that she was wearing. I can't believe it took you two so long to finally walk down the aisle. Margaret cackled. You're the one who told me to take my time. Esme grinned sheepishly. I was a bit overprotective, wasn't I? Margaret pinched a bit of air between her fingers, then squished it. A little bit, but it's all been worth the wait. They both looked up as the church clock chimed 11. You ready to become Mrs. Scott Campbell? That'll be Mrs. Margaret Campbell to you, thank you very much. Course it will. Esme said, tears glassing over her eyes. Course it will. The dogs, with Heather and Rose boutonnieres pinned to their collars, led the way as Esme and then Margaret entered the candlelit stone chapel she and Scott had agreed was the perfect place to exchange vows. As she walked down the aisle, her hand tucked in her father's arm, her eyes were glued to the man she couldn't wait to call her husband. She should be looking at her guests and beaming in anticipation. Everyone was there from Heatherglen, Scott's Ambo crew, Charles, Flora Lyle, and all the rest of the staff from the medical and veterinary clinics. Her family, her sister fresh from uni with not 1 but 2 degrees and a plan to continue her studies as a medical doctor. When she reached Scott, her father lifted her veil and gave her a kiss on her cheek. He turned to Scott with a twinkle in his eye and said sternly, I would ask you to take care of our wee lassie here, but I know you'll be taking care of each other from here on out. Aye, Mr. Murray, that we will. Scott took her hand in his and leant in to give her a kiss until the vicar reminded them they hadn't quite reached that part yet. The rest of the ceremony passed in a dream. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Vows of love and commitment that brought tears to each of their eyes. Words she knew they would cherish forever, and that would render their love unbreakable. They'd been through the worst, and now at long last, they were ready to embark on the rest of their lives together. Are you ready to kiss the bride? Asked the vicar. Never been more ready in my life, Scott said, already leaning forward to give Margaret a kiss that would bind them together finally for a lifetime. The end.